And we're live. Sorry for that false start, everyone. But glad you're here with us now on a Saturday afternoon. I'm here with Scarlett Kim, a senior staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union. And this is a story that, in a week where we're talking so much about attacks on freedom of speech, attacks on freedom of the press, pressure on news organizations, we are here to discuss the possible imminent deportation of an award-winning journalist, a Southeast Emmy award-winning journalist, Mario Guavara, who was covering a protest, the No Kings protest earlier this year, and has spent most of the time since that time in solitary confinement and is fighting deportation to El Salvador, where he faces persecution. And to discuss this today is Scarlett Kim, who represents him with the ACLU. Scarlett, thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday. Can you tell me a bit about Mr. Guevara's story? When he's been in the United States for more than a decade, when did he come here, and what was the persecution that he was escaping back in El Salvador?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on, Adam. So Mr. Guevara came to the United States in 2004, so actually over 20 years ago, and he's been in this country since then. He is from El Salvador originally, and while he was in El Salvador, he was working as a journalist for El Prensa Gráfica, which is one of the two largest newspapers there. And while he was reporting in El Salvador, he received threats and harassment, threats of violence, and he fled, therefore, in 2004 with his family to the United States. And he entered this country lawfully at that time on a visa. Since he's arrived in the United States, he's basically continued his journalistic career since. He spent a long time working for Georgia's largest Spanish-speaking newspaper. And most recently I believe it was 2023, he founded his own outlet called MG News, which is an incredible news outlet that focuses primarily on live streaming law enforcement activity with a particular emphasis on immigration raids. So he has over 1 million followers who follow him, and almost on a daily basis, he would wake up at 6 a.m. and following tips and leads, he would basically live stream ICE raids as they were happening in real time. I can also now shift into sort of what's been happening the last few months, but that's sort of the backdrop to Mario's story.
Well, please do. So everything took a turn, as I understand it, with the No Kings protest when he was filming and doing what you were describing, live streaming law enforcement during the protest, and he was arrested. Tell us what happened.
Yes. So in June, he was filming a No Kings protest, and he was doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing. He was wearing visible ID. He made it clear that he was a member of the press. He maintained a reasonable distance from law enforcement and from the protesters. And he was arrested by the police, and they charged him with basically like blocking a roadway and interference with law enforcement, and those charges were actually dropped very shortly thereafter. The circumstances around his arrest were really concerning. He was the only journalist arrested at the event, and he was, I believe, one of the only non-citizen journalists reporting on the protest on that day. Unfortunately, what happened, which is typical, is that when a non-citizen is arrested on local charges, it's very common for ICE to issue what's called a detainer, where they ask the local law enforcement to essentially hold the person in detention until ICE can transfer them into their custody. So that's exactly what happened. Even though the criminal charges, the underlying misdemeanor charges stemming from the protest were ultimately dismissed, ICE took Mr. Guevara into detention in June, and it has essentially not released him since that time. On Monday, he'll actually have been in detention for 100 days, almost entirely in that period with ICE.
And let's get into the technical details of what happened because they're extraordinary. You had, as I understand it, two separate judges had ordered his release until the government, the second time, it was first the judge after the criminal charges collapsed, ordered his release, then an immigration judge ordered his release. The Trump administration sought an emergency stay of the release. Can you take it from there? What happened after that?
Yeah, I believe actually there were 3 orders of release on
Uh,
bond. The underlying criminal charges, he was ordered release on bond. They were misdemeanor charges. It's very common. But ICE, took him into their custody. Um, Shortly after the charges were filed for his documenting of the protest, he was hit with a couple of misdemeanor traffic charges that had allegedly occurred about a month prior to the protest, and the circumstances around those charges were also quite mysterious. It's very unusual for someone to be hit with traffic charges weeks after they occurred. Those charges were also dropped, and he was also released on bond right before they were dropped. ICE. While Mr. Guevara has had him in its custody, an immigration judge actually also determined that he should be released on bond on July 1st. But what's really remarkable and extraordinary was at that hearing, the government argued that it was Mr. Guevara's live streaming and reporting that posed a danger to the community, and that the government therefore opposed his release on those grounds. After the immigration judge ordered his release on bond, the government filed an emergency stay motion and an appeal, arguing again repeatedly that it is his reporting that is a danger to the community, and on that basis refused to release him. Because of the government's refusal to release him on the basis that it is his reporting and live streaming that is dangerous, which are core First Amendment protected activities, we then filed a habeas petition in federal court in August seeking his release from immigration detention.
And I'm going to read from that habeas petition that you filed that went straight to that point. It's just jarring to hear, just as a kind of background for folks watching now, that usually in bond bail hearings, you hear arguments about whether someone is a risk of flight or a danger to the community. And to hear them argue that the news gathering, the reporting is a danger to the community is extraordinary. This is from uh, the habeas petition. In the notice of appeal, the government states that Mr. Guevara is a danger to the community because Mr. Guevara had, quote, on 5 separate occasions recorded or live streamed law enforcement officers and, quote, posted videos of undercover officers, their vehicles, and tag numbers. The government further states that local law enforcement reviewed Mr. Guevara's public posts and learned that the videos were viewed by hundreds of thousands of people. So he's live streaming law enforcement, and some of them happen to be undercover at the time because they are at a protest. Uh, what was the response? Where do things stand right now? You have uh, appealed this case. You brought the habeas petition. Tell us the most recent development on Friday and why it seems now his deportation may be imminent.
I would like to just clarify one thing, which is that it's not entirely clear that there were undercover officers when Mr. Guevara was filming on those 5 separate occasions. And even if there were undercover officers, courts have stated that it's still First Amendment protected activity to photograph or film them or record those videos. And the reason for that is because an exception for undercover officers would essentially eviscerate the rule that you could film or photograph officers, since it's obviously not clear to a member of the public or a member of the press when they're filming law enforcement activity occurring in the public who or who might not be an undercover officer. So I wanted to clarify all of that. In
A good
terms of what's
clarification.
Sure. In terms of what's happened recently, on Friday, essentially, the government, in addition to detaining Mr. Guevara, has been in the process of trying to remove him. And Mr. Guevara's immigration history is a little bit complicated, but essentially 13 years ago, he was in the process of seeking relief from being removed from the country after entering lawfully. And the government agreed to drop any removal proceedings against him, and for 13 years has given him authorization to live and work here. And in addition, Mr. Guevara has a legal pathway both to a green card and to citizenship. He has 2 U.S. citizen children. He has a U.S. citizen mother, a U.S. citizen sister. All of those folks reside here in the United States. But the government is determined to essentially remove Mr. Guevara. So, despite having closed those removal proceedings, despite the fact that he has a pathway to a green card and citizenship, on Friday they issued a decision essentially stating that they were reopening the 13-year-old deportation proceedings, and that they were going to order him removed, notwithstanding the fact that his U.S. citizen son has a petition for him to sponsor him for a green card in motion. And because there's now been essentially a decision made that Mr. Guevara is ultimately removable and he's in detention, our fear is that in this type of circumstance, a person facing that kind of final order can be imminently deported and placed on a plane so that he could be imminently deported to El Salvador at any time.
So what's the status now? Are folks waiting to see what happens? Is there a judge that this case is in front of that we can hear some order from soon? Where do things stand?
Yeah, so on Friday we went back to the federal district court where Mr. Guevara has his habeas petition in front of, and we updated the court on what's happened, and we noted that we were afraid that Mr. Guevara would be imminently deported, and we noted. I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little bit technical here, but
Right.
there's there's a reason. There are multiple reasons why he shouldn't be deported, but one of the reasons is that even though his removal proceedings were reopened 13 years ago, when the government determined that he was removable and then shut down the removal proceedings, they had stated that prior to shutting down the removal proceedings, that Mr. Guevara could voluntarily depart the country in 60 days. So now that the government has reopened the removal proceedings, that voluntary departure grant has now been kind of reinstated. It's now live again. So basically, what Mr. Guevara has against him is not a final order of removal. He has basically a grant of voluntary departure where he is permitted now to leave the country within 60 days. He still is obviously looking for avenues to try and remain in the country, but that's sort of his current immigration status. The problem is that even though he has this 60-day period within which to depart the country, because the government has been unlawfully detaining him, he's in detention. And when you're in detention, even if you have this grant of voluntary departure, the government can seek to essentially place you on a plane at any moment. And so we went before the court to say, he's been unlawfully detained for weeks now. And as a consequence of that unlawful detention, even though he has this grant of voluntary departure, he may be imminently placed on a plane. And so this potentially tragic consequence where he's shuttled onto a plane and sent back to El Salvador at any moment really flows from the unlawful detention. And therefore, we asked the court to basically enjoin his imminent removal from the country and also to order his immediate release since his detention is unlawful. On Friday, the court did order an emergency hearing, but made no decision at that time and asked for additional briefing, which we'll be filing next week.
Okay. And you had mentioned, I believe, that Mr. Guevara has been spending a good portion of his detention in solitary confinement. Can you describe that? I think you said 22 hours a day.
Yeah, the conditions are extremely harsh and punitive. He spends 22 hours a day alone in his cell. He's not permitted to communicate with other detainees. He's allowed 2 hours outside, but he's not allowed in the general recreation area. When he goes outside, he's basically enclosed in like what's a metal cage. I think he's described it as almost like a dog cage. So he's able to breathe fresh air, but he's not really able to move around very much. And he's also, because he's confined in that space, again, even when he's outside, really not permitted to interact with or enjoy recreation time with other detainees.
Does he ever get to see his family, his children?
Mhm. I believe his family has visited him a few times. Unfortunately, the detention center that he's located at right now is a 5-hour drive from his family, who are Atlanta based. So it's been difficult, I think, to see him with any frequency. They do try and speak with him as much as possible.
And of course, the UN has said quite often that long term solitary confinement can amount to torture. And it's been how long? Close to 100 days?
He's been in detention for 100 days on Monday, and he spent a lot of that period in solitary confinement. He's been shuttled around to many different facilities. So the first facility, ICE facility he was at in Folkestone, he went there in June. He was placed in solitary confinement for some period of time, I believe maybe a few weeks. Then he was shuttled around to a few other facilities and he returned to Folkestone, I believe, in July, and he was replaced in solitary confinement when he returned to Folkestone. So he's been in solitary confinement for many weeks now since returning to Folkestone.
Did authorities even try to state any kind of justification for that? What did they say for the reason for putting him in solitary for such a long time?
It's not clear what the original justification was when he was placed in solitary confinement. Now the justification has been that it's for his own safety because at a prior facility he was extorted by some other inmates. Um, but I think it's not an either or situation. I think it's incumbent upon the facility to ensure his safety, and it doesn't need to do it in a way that's this harsh and punitive.
One of the things that I find so extraordinary about this story coming to a head at this week is that we're talking about all these threats to freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel's show, and the pressure on news organizations, the FCC. And here's someone who faces imminent deportation for after live streaming at a protest, and an award-winning journalist who's won a Southeast Emmy and he could face imminent detention. He spent so much time in solitary confinement, and I feel like this story has not gotten the attention that it deserves this particular week. Has that been your impression?
Yes, it has been my impression. I think part of the reason is that I don't know, but I think part of the reason just might be the immigration and deportation context. I think folks are not fully aware of just how draconian and how broad the authority of the government is, and how it can really leverage immigration enforcement to shut down speech. I think that has sort of been an undertold story about the massive uptick in immigration enforcement activities that we're seeing. But I think, some folks who have logged on might be aware of, for example, the fact that ICE agents wear masks and don't wear visible ID, drive unmarked cars. Recently, DHS Secretary Noem said that filming or recording law enforcement agents carrying out immigration enforcement activities is akin to violence. I think this is all of a piece of that, which is that they basically want to shut down any kind of public discussion or transparency or accountability around these activities. But I think maybe part of the problem is just that immigration enforcement has many different tentacles, and it's just shocking and disturbs the conscience how the government has been carrying out these tactics. And I think just an undertold piece of that story is how it also uses immigration enforcement to suppress speech.
Have you spoken to his family recently? How are they holding up?
We have spoken intermittently to his family. We did speak with them yesterday to update them about the hearing. I mean, I think that they're doing the best that they can. They are suffering a lot. Mr. Guevara was one of the primary breadwinners for the family. One of his children suffers from a really serious, debilitating injury as a result of a stroke he experienced while undergoing brain surgery. He relies on his dad a lot for physical and emotional support. I think it's just been really, really difficult, and they're just doing what they can to survive.
Obviously, Mr. Guevara fled persecution back home. If he were deported, what are the sort of threats that he fears that's awaiting him back in the country of his birth?
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite clear since it's been so long since he's since he's left the country. But I think, the Committee to Protect Journalists has noted that Mr. Guevara's the only journalist who's been detained for his reporting in the United States. But they've also done a ton of research and analysis of press freedoms or lack thereof in El Salvador. So I think one of the real fears that Mr. Guevara has is that, will he be able to continue his vocation as a journalist? And if so, what kind of threats will he be exposed to or vulnerable to?
Mm. I saw someone mentioning this in the chat just now. There are folks who are obviously very alarmed by his story right now, want to do something to contribute. How can people who are alarmed about these issues act on it and make a difference in this particular case?
I believe that the Committee to Protect Journalists this coming week will be rolling out a website and putting out some action items in line with the fact that Mario will have spent 100 days in detention. I believe that will be on Monday. I also urge folks, especially those in Georgia, to potentially contact the senators in Georgia to let them know that you're concerned and would love for them to speak out about this issue and seek more transparency and information from the government as to what's going on with Mr. Guevara's situation.
Thank you very much, Scarlett Kim, for joining us on short notice on a Saturday. Please keep us posted about everything that's going on in this case. I'll be following the habeas case as it continues in federal court. For folks who are joining us a little bit late, you've been watching an interview about the case of Mario Guavara, an award-winning journalist who has been detained for nearly 100 days now after covering a No Kings protest. This video I will publish it in its entirety on All Rise News. If you're not a subscriber right now, click at the top left of your screen. You'll see this entire video in full with more information, more developments, and I'll keep in touch with the ACLU and their great work to find out the latest about the case. Thank you for
Thank you so
joining.
much. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.